And good morning. It's time for the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. And now your host, Mike Hewitt.
Hey, good morning. Listen, today's going to be a fun show. We've got a couple guests lined up, and then, of course, the Enigma Report. First, we're going to be talking with Jim Simpson, who's an author, columnist, and researcher. And then following Jim will be a fellow named Harvey Clear, who is a professor of politics and history at Emory University. He's author of a number of books, but what we'll be talking about him today with is Joe McCarthy and getting that story straight. So, listen, start off with Jim Simpson. Welcome to the Mike Hewitt Show.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
I think when we started out by accidentally hanging up on you. So
that's all right.
Listen,
that can happen. That's the way we like to, let you know how the show's going to go.
That's how you start out with it. That's right. We want to start out on the right foot. Listen, Jim Riley is with us. Brian Thomas is the producer. He's the guy that keeps us on track and sometimes tells us when we're wrong here on the air.
Sometimes hangs up on your coach.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, listen, we're never going to play catch because obviously when I passed the ball, it didn't work so well. Listen, what brings me to want to talk to you is tell us a little bit about the Red-Green Axis, refugees, immigration, and the agenda to erase America. What's this about, Jim?
Sure. Well, with Donald Trump skyrocketing in the polls, it's obvious that most Americans are extremely concerned about illegal immigration. But what a lot of people don't even know about, and is potentially even more frightening, is the refugee resettlement program. And in its current iteration, it follows the 1980 Refugee Resettlement Act, which was penned largely by Teddy Kennedy or one of his staff, signed into law by Carter, and it places the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in charge of deciding who most of our refugees are. So if you notice, we've been getting a ton of refugees from Muslim countries, and most of those are chosen by the UN High Commissioner, who in turn is heavily influenced by the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which is the second largest organization in the world next to the UN. It's
Jim, I've just got a question here because you could have knocked me off my chair. I thought that the decision to allow refugees in, at least under certain legal sanctions, as opposed to the open border that we have down south.
Right.
But I thought that those refugees that was determined by our government. You're telling me that the United Nations is actually making those decisions?
The United Nations refers about 85%. That's not a hard number, but it's somewhere in that proportion of all refugees that are referred to the United States. The UN High Commissioner sends in referrals. He gets applications, as it were, from refugees, and they look them over, and they send those applications to the United States State Department. The State Department, essentially, they can decide, and they supposedly vet these refugees for terror connections and things like that, although they're really limited in what they can do. And as we've heard from the FBI, they guarantee that they cannot guarantee any way to assess the refugees coming from Syria. But yes, largely the State Department rubber stamps whatever the UN sends us in the way of refugee referrals.
Wow.
And so an example of that would be, of course, if you look at Great Britain, with specifically London, I just read yesterday where the number one male baby name is Muhammad in London. And listen, I'm not making a racial statement or anything like that. It's just an overwhelming shift of population. And it's happening.
And culture.
in culture, and it's way beyond our own borders. It's a shift, I don't want to say against the West, but I think it goes to the point of our topic. There appears to be a global agenda at play to erase a Western culture. Am I off base in saying that?
No, and that's the title of my book, The Red-Green Axis, Refugees, Immigration, and the Agenda to Erase America. And it's a very, that is exactly what is happening. The refugee resettlement program is actually currently, and listen to this because you will recognize a lot of other aspects of our current government's actions about it. In 1976, the UN had a conference on human settlements in Vancouver, Canada. That conference laid the groundwork for Agenda 21. It also laid the groundworks for worldwide resettlement policies. And their universal goals were, among other things, to abolish private property, because the UN claims that property is too important an asset to be left in the hands of the unreliable market. It has to be controlled by the government. They want to seek equitable distribution of land, resources, and populations.
Right. What you're actually doing, Jim, is you're running through the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto.
Well, yes, that's exactly right.
I mean, that's what I just recognized it. In fact, you almost did it in order.
Yeah, and it demands that nations immediately develop settlement policies. And the thing is, they're all socialists, and this whole equitable distribution idea, most people think of it in terms of income, but no, they seek to redistribute everything. Now, and it's not equitable because none of the communist countries have any programs like this. You don't see communist China or Russia taking any refugees, or any other, Cuba, none of them. They don't take refugees. They shed refugees, but they don't take any. And so this is all targeting the West. And the idea is to subvert our culture, subvert the rule of law, subvert our understanding, our 1,000-year-old understanding of how human behavior should be organized. And we have proven that our method is the best.
Is there something we can
destroy it because it gets in the way of their agenda?
Is there something we can do to stop this?
Well, the 1980 Refugee Act needs to be abolished or heavily amended. And there's a number of organizations around the country, and specifically in Michigan, in fact, working very hard to attempt to do that. Now, the way the law is written, it's very secretive. There are 9 what they call voluntary agencies. These are private organizations. They're not voluntary in any sense of the word. They get about $1 billion a year from the federal government to split between them to resettle refugees, and they have become heavy-duty lobbyists for ever-increasing refugee resettlement. Now, you may have heard that there are 14 senators, we call them the Jihad Caucus, who have been advocating that the United States take in 65,000 Syrian refugees, and there is strong suspicion that Obama is going to increase the total number of refugees from 70,000 to about twice that in order to accommodate those 65,000 Syrians. We have little power to do anything about it, and the voluntary agencies, by the way, are the ones who lobbied hard for that increase. And it's because they make money. Every time they get to resettle a refugee, they make money. I have estimated it's about $7,000 per refugee, even though they claim they only get maybe $1,000 to initially place the refugees in a location.
So there are a lot of different people, organizations, countries, and companies with an agenda at play, and none of those agendas, like for instance, to your point about $7,000, they've turned the refugees into a commodity. And then there's
cash flow. They've turned it into a cash flow.
It's a commodity.
And the VOLAGs are 6 of them are ostensibly or nominally religious, like Catholic Charities or Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, but they're not charitable in any sense of the word. Their top officers make very, very good salaries, and they are pretty upfront about the fact that we're going to make money on this. And they lobby and they compete with each other to get these refugees because they make so much money on it. And they do it all secretly. They do not let people know. For example, in Michigan, you may not be aware that just so far there have been 2,000 refugees brought into Michigan just this year. There's a total of over 4,000 planned for this year, which includes 80 in Ann Arbor, Battle Creek, 140, Dearborn, another 640, Grand Rapids, 740, Lansing, 617, Troy, 1,215, just for this year. And you don't know that. And we are not given any opportunity to question or protest it. Those refugees are dumped in our laps, and they are left with, and we are left with dealing with the consequences, whether it be crime, whether it be huge increases in burdens on schools. You know, I went to New England in June and spoke with some mayors there. In Manchester, New Hampshire, Central High School, the mayor told me there's 82 different languages spoken.
Where's local and state government? Michigan, but in general, I mean, obviously there's an absence of media, as there usually is on these type of issues. But listen, it seems to me like Governor Snyder or any governor, regardless of political party, will be able to hold their palm out and say, stop.
Yeah, they should. And in fact, South Carolina has done just that. They've created a law that says that recognizes the reality of this law, that it is not constitutional. It represents an unfunded mandate. And so South Carolina says, well, we recognize that this is advisory in nature, and we're not going to fund any refugee resettlement in our state unless the county chooses to resettle refugees. And if the county chooses so, we will release funds to that county. But the county has to decide about it. And, you know, it's a small change, but it's potentially a big one. And a lot of different states could do a lot of things like that. Most of them don't want to deal with it because in the big picture, they're not dealing with a lot of money. The federal government provides much of what the state ultimately pays in supporting these refugees, and the local governments nobody pays attention to them.
Well, Jim, this is clearly driven by our national government.
Yes.
What about, we have elected representatives, we have elected senators. Are these folks, are they totally helpless, or is this thing on autopilot and nobody can change it in any way, shape, or form?
Well, it's kind of like the Republican Congress saying they can't do anything with Obama in office. They could do a lot of things, but they're unwilling to fight. They're unwilling to be called, racists or nativists, which is the latest term. They're afraid of that, and they dismiss it. They think, it's not that big of a deal. Plus, on the other side of the balance sheet, you have different companies throughout the states. Meat packing is a big industry, for example, that thrives on bringing in refugees, specifically Somalis, to work in their meatpacking plants.
No, Jim, let me stop you for just a second, because I don't want us to run out of time before I ask this. There are people driving down the road right now listening to the show, and they're thinking, what's wrong with the concept of taking in a refugee? You mentioned Somali. There are 4 or 5 young people that were brought into our community where I raised my daughters at, and they've been able to assimilate into the community and do very well. And so there's people saying, what's wrong with that? So tell us from your perspective what the problem is.
I don't think there is anything wrong with that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with accepting people from all over the world that want to come here, to want to immigrate here, and want to assimilate. The fact, however, is that most of them don't. Most of them don't want to assimilate. For example, refugees get an incredible amount of backing to do to quote unquote assimilate. They have all kinds of special grants. For example, a refugee can open a savings account and get each deposit that he places matched 1-for-1 by the federal government up to $2,000.
Wish they'd do that for me.
Yeah, no kidding. And these are for the purchase of a car, they're for the purchase of a house, for any kind of purchase. And they have many programs like this specifically for refugees. Despite that fact, as it stands right now, 56% of refugees who arrived here within the last 5 years remain on Medicaid or their own medical program called Refugee Medical Assistance. 47% are still on cash assistance, 74% are still on food stamps, and 22.8% are still getting subsidies for public housing after 5 years.
Do you think there's really an agenda at play to erase America, or at least America's culture?
Within the left, within the hard left, absolutely. The vast majority of people don't really get it, and they think, oh, well, what's the matter with bringing in a few refugees? But we don't bring in a few. We bring in hundreds of thousands, and they are changing the complexion of many of our cities throughout the country, as Michigan knows all too well. Now, I want to tell you there's a 9/12 group in Michigan that does a lot of work with this, and I wish I had their email. I just had their email, and I lost that. I lost that, but they do great work. And they're really trying to fight this thing.
Jim, listen, we're out of time, but tell folks how they can get a copy of your Red Green Access, Refugees, Immigration, and the Agenda to Erase America.
Well, on Amazon, it's easy to go. Just type in my name, James Simpson, and refugees. That'd be enough. Or Red Green Axis. They could go to the Center for Security Policy website. That's centerforsecuritypolicy.org, and we have a link there.
I just purchased the book on Amazon. It's currently it's at $2.99.
Well, that's $2.99 as a
Kindle
ebook.
Yep.
And there's also a $6 print version.
It has every review is 5 stars. I'm really looking forward to reading it. To me, this is stunning because again, cloaked in we must be caring about other people, and in fact is an agenda. I guess what shocks me and really disappoints me is our apparent helplessness in the face of this.
It does. Yeah. It does seem to be that way.
Well, the law really does need to be changed, but there are things that we can do. Anytime citizens protest and demand some kind of public hearing on this, the voluntary agencies usually just shrink back into the shadows and go somewhere else.
No question. So, Jim, listen, I got to stop you because I'm backed up into another segment. But thank you very, very much for joining us, and we're going to look forward to having you back on again.
Well, thank you, sir.
Very good. Thanks, Jim Simpson.
Yep, bye-bye.
Folks, we'll be right back. And Harvey Clare is on the line with us. Harvey is a professor of politics and history at Emory University and the author of a lot of books. And I stumbled on Harvey Clare by accident, and I'm really glad I did. Harvey, you wrote a piece called "Setting the Record on Joe McCarthy Straight." Is that right?
Yes.
First off, welcome to the show. But
thank you.
But listen, I got to dive in on that. What is that piece telling folks?
Well, for certainly in the academic world where I live, Joe McCarthy is an arch villain,
right,
and has been for a very, very long time. My research has focused on material in the last 20 years, material coming out of Russian and American archives after the end of the Cold War, and what that material has revealed is that the extent of Soviet espionage in the United States was far, far greater than many people had thought. And so among some people, not all, but some people on the political right, there was a kind of a revival of Joe McCarthy had it right. What McCarthy said was correct about the extent of communist infiltration of the American government. And what my research shows is that McCarthy was right on some major points, that there had been extensive infiltration of the government, but he was wrong on most of the details, and that's why I wanted to, as I put it in the article, set the record straight.
When you look at him, do you think in fact, even it's kind of funny, me do a little insight, even when talking about having you on, in my place of business, people's automatic response to him was, even if he was right, he's a rotten, terrible villain. And to me, I don't think he knew the details, which goes to your point, but that was the purpose of what he was trying to do, is to uncover the details. Now, I'm not trying to make him a saint. I don't think that he was. But to your point, the bigger issue is he was spot on in terms of the trouble that we're in. And what, for me, makes it such a big issue now is that we're really politically not that far removed. Anyone that says anything that questions the path that America is on right now, you automatically get painted into the McCarthyism vein. And were his tactics right? I don't know. But man, when he said we were being infiltrated, to a large degree, I think he was right.
Well, he was right that there was a very serious national security issue and problem. The difficulty with McCarthy is that, first of all, he was not the first one or the only one to make that claim. And the problem with him is that he was reckless, and he was very careless with facts. And the charges he was making were very, very serious. And given that, I think it's incumbent on you to be careful, so that he was accusing people essentially of treason, and he threw around charges with very little basis in fact, and he confused and conflated a number of different categories. I mean, it's one thing to say that somebody was that some American was a spy for the Soviet Union. And that's different than saying somebody was a communist fellow traveler. Now, I don't hold any brief for somebody who was a communist fellow traveler, but to accuse a person like that of espionage, that's a serious mistake. It's like, or to accuse General George Marshall, who had been Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, to accuse Marshall of being part of the communist conspiracy, which McCarthy did, was both reckless and utterly irresponsible.
You wrote a book, Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America. And in fact, that's one of the things I focused on a lot, if nothing else, for the word Venona, which immediately attracted my attention. And in my own first book, in fact, I use that to name a computer structure, frankly. But when you look at the amount, well, let me back myself up a little bit, if I might. When I look at Joe McCarthy and the efforts that he made, right or wrong, and I look at Hollywood in general, which seems to be a large focus of his. If I look at the Bing Crosby era before that, 1940s, those old kind of movies, the Technicolor era, if you will, they, at least my interpretation, and maybe wrongfully, but they tended to be middle of the road in terms of their political lean. And after Joe McCarthy, they have really become what I consider to be uber left. I mean, for me, a trip to the video store is very frustrating. By the time I make the circuit around, I'm pretty disgusted and with the filth that they've got out and the uber left politics that they're advocating. And I almost pinned that on Joe McCarthy. It's like he let the cat out of the bag, and it just went hog wild. Now, am I off the reservation with that kind of thinking?
Well, I think it's a little bit off in the sense that McCarthy, the government body that looked at Hollywood and investigated Hollywood was the House Un-American Activities Committee, and McCarthy was never involved with that. McCarthy's major focus, he had a few ancillary focuses, but his major focus was the State Department. In fact, during the 1930s and into the 1940s, there was a significant communist presence in Hollywood, but that was not really related to, and it's the impact of everything was not related to Joe McCarthy. It's part of the kind of the demonization of McCarthy that everything, every effort to examine communism in American life is tarred with the label McCarthyism.
Right.
So McCarthy was a latecomer to all this. I mean, he didn't start till 1950, and an awful lot had happened to fight communism by people a lot more responsible than Joe McCarthy before he even appeared on the scene.
Yep, no question about that. Let me ask you the obvious. I don't know where your politics at, and frankly, that doesn't matter for what we're discussing. But do you consider communism and the threat that we had that had been coming from the Soviet Union to be a threat to America, literally?
Absolutely.
Okay. How do you when I look at it, Chris, it's tough for me not to put it in a domestic prism. But I look at little things like my fedora hat went out of style, and I often quip that when it went out of style, so did respect. And so, I'm probably seeing things from a very narrow vein there, and I'll admit that up front. But what do you think the greatest threat is as it relates to communism for America?
Well, I think the sad thing and the thing that a lot of people have tended to forget for a variety of reasons is that in the late 1940s, an anti-communist consensus developed in the United States that included not only conservatives but also liberals, you had a situation, for example, one of the most effective fighters against the communist influence in American life from 1945 on was Hubert Humphrey, the liberal Democrat from Minnesota. The Communist Party was very strong in Minnesota, and Hubert Humphrey led the fight within what was called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. I guess it still is called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Hubert Humphrey led the fight in that party to oust the communists. In 1948, the communists and their supporters backed Henry Wallace for president against Harry Truman. You had a strong anti-communist consensus in America in the late 40s, and that gradually eroded so that today, unfortunately, if you ask many liberals about anti-communism, that's McCarthyism.
Right.
Well, anti-communism was part of the definition of liberalism in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
Let me ask you a question, just because since you mentioned Henry Wallace. There was an article just recently talking about how Wikipedia has really been politicized and in some cases having dozens of changes within a day on issues that are politically sensitive. And I'm looking at Henry Wallace's Wikipedia article. It makes no mention of his communist connection, aside from the fact that he was accused of being soft on communism. Did not the Venona papers point the finger at Henry Wallace, who, by the way, was a vice president, the final vice president before Harry Truman under Roosevelt?
Yeah, no. What the Venona documents indicate, not that Wallace was a communist or anything. He was an idiot.
We certainly agree on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, thankfully, our current vice president doesn't share any of that.
Wallace was a dupe. He was, and some of the people around him were communists. Were secret communists. We now know.
So he was a useful idiot, is what you're saying.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
But there have been, I have read articles that have stated that, in fact, he was a communist spy. He was, in fact, passing on very secret information to the Soviet Union at the time. Is that true or not? It certainly is not there in Wikipedia.
No, that's not true.
Okay, just a useful idiot. Useful
idiot, yep.
All right.
What a way to go down in history.
There is a political party for those folks, too, I think, in this country today.
What's the way forward? Because from my vantage point, and again, not to be shrill, but in fact, with the last guest, I mentioned in passing the Communist Manifesto. When I go down the checklist of the Communist Manifesto, I think we're a lot closer. Forget the words that we use. We're a lot closer in reality than people realize, and nobody seems to be alarmed about it.
Well, I think that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern European communist states collapsed, there was this belief, communism is dead, and deservedly so. Now there's what I would call sort of, communist nostalgia, and there's a kind of forgetfulness of just how evil that system was. And in the United States, we don't have very many open defenders of communism, but you have people who soft pedal the meaning of the doctrine. I mean, the fact, for example, that Bernie Sanders took his honeymoon in the Soviet Union, or Bill de Blasio was a devoted Sandinista supporter. It's a kind of blindness. If you had people on the right that were nostalgic for fascism, the media, and rightfully so, would be all over them.
They'd be up in arms, no pun intended.
That's correct.
Listen, I had a guest on some time ago, Harvey. The woman was born in the Soviet Union, in fact, was married, raised, brought her kids up to be 8, 9, 10 years old right after the Soviet Union fell or collapsed. As soon as she was legally capable, she fled the Soviet Union. And so I had her on the show, and at the time of the show, we were doing 1-hour interviews. So it was 3 segments. And in the first segment, when she described what it was like to be a young person and being educated in the Soviet Union. By the way, she received a degree in ballistic missile technology. So it's a very different culture than we have. And in the second segment, she talked about what it was like to raise children and be married, what it was like to go to a grocery store when there was only bread and vodka, and the absence of Christmas and those types of holidays. And in the third segment, I said, now listen, you've been in the United States since 1992 or so. Tell me what you see here. And she said, that's what I've been telling you for the last 40 minutes. And listen, it sent a shiver down my spine. I don't think people realize where we're at.
Well, I think they're serious problems, and a kind of forgetfulness about collectivism and its evils.
Very, very, very true statement. What's the next book you've got coming out, Harvey?
Well, I'm getting ready to retire, and I have a project that I've been working on for a long time. It's a biography of a guy who started out life as a communist and became a multimillionaire in the United States, and he's a real character. He was married 4 times. He kind of a shady figure, and my wife says it's my one shot at a mini-series, so I'll see.
I love it. I love it. Where can folks find what you've written? Are you Amazon, or do you have a website?
Yeah,
how can people
Amazon
find you?
Amazon is probably the best place. I've written about 8 or 9 books, and most of them are still available on Amazon.
I got to tell you, I'm about 2/3 of the way through my second book. So when I looked at your list, I was extraordinarily impressed, especially after I started thumbing through some of the reviews of them. Very, very nice work.
Well, thank you. If I can make one shameless plug,
please.
One book you might want to read. My co-author John Haynes and I did it, called "In Denial," which is an account of how American academics have refused to confront the new evidence that has come out of Russian and American archives about Soviet espionage. Yeah,
and that's at the final segment of this show, I always do a little section, not always, but mostly, called the Enigma Report, and usually it's things, as the word would imply, that frankly I just can't understand. And one of the things that I'm going to touch on today that I can't understand is our general apathy to something that I consider over the top serious. That to me is an enigma.
Well, when we send our children to very, very expensive universities and we have no clue what they are being taught, and that's in quotes. I'd love. Actually, I'm looking at your book right now on Amazon, and I'm lamenting the fact that it's not on Kindle.
Well, yeah, I have no control over that sort of stuff, but that book. John Haynes and I were quite frankly shocked at the mendacity of so many American academics when confronted with evidence. Somebody once said that I think it was George Orwell that said that that's an idea that's so stupid that only an academic could believe it. And there's the one thing that I love in the Venona material. There's a message from a KGB officer stationed in Washington during World War II, and he reports back to Moscow that he's had a meeting with Harry Dexter White, who was the number 2 man in the Treasury Department and a very important Soviet source, and that White they drove around Washington D.C. in White's car, and White laid out the American negotiating strategy for the first meeting of the United Nations, and so we wrote about that in our book on Venona, and one historian talked about the fact that this is not evidence of espionage. He said it's just one government official informing an ally about matters of mutual concern. And our response to that was, it's very, very common for a high-ranking government official to drive around his car in Washington with a KGB officer and give away American negotiating secrets. Yeah, that's not a matter of concern. Why would you worry about that?
Absolutely incredible. Listen, Harvey Clear, I've got to let you go. We're late for a break, but I've genuinely enjoyed your time with us today, and I appreciate you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Folks, we'll be right back.
And now back to the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com and the Enigma Report.
I really like doing the Enigma Report. Jim Riley, what do you think?
I like listening to it.
Listen, the Enigma Report, what's an enigma, Jim?
An enigma that's a good question. An enigma is something that just doesn't seem to make any dang sense. But it still happens.
Something, a place or a person or a thing you just can't get your head around. One of the things I wanted to start off with, I've got a short list, but one of them is a quote. One cannot and must not try to erase the past merely because it does not fit the present. And that was a quote from Golda Meir. And the reason I'm offering that quote is it's an enigma to me. I couldn't find a culture that didn't embrace that rationale, except for in modern America, in our contemporary media. We seem bent on erasing our own past the American Indians, the Indonesians, Chinese, every culture I looked for last night had a quote along with Golda Meir that said, don't erase your past, don't do that. Learn by it. And to me, it's an enigma that so many people out of political correctness are willing to kick the American can out of sight so they don't have to deal with who we are and how we got here. And we all know the common sense says then that means we don't know where we're going.
Well, it's a very effective and powerful political tool, unfortunately.
Well, let me tell you this. Did you know, we talk about this every year, but did you know $1 trillion would be a stack of $1,000 bills 67 miles high?
I did not know that, really. 67 miles high?
And so we're a little over $18 trillion right now. And so that means it would be 1,206 miles high, which is a little over where the average satellite and spy plane find themselves.
Well, that means we need a $10,000 bill.
Another way of looking at it is if we took $1 bills and put them end to end, it would be enough to go to Saturn and back, the planet Saturn.
Oh God, is that one trillion or is that 18 trillion?
That's what 18 trillion.
18 trillion.
18
okay.
trillion. But who's counting?
Yeah.
Just between friends, it's only 18 trillion bucks.
A trillion here,
we don't
a
even
trillion
bother
there.
worried about that stuff no more. Which is an enigma to me.
Yes.
When you think of, and by the way, folks, that's just federal debt. That's not county, township, city, state.
Well, that's cash flow. That does not count the underfunding, the on-funding of Medicaid, Medicare, the VA, Social Security, SSI, SSD, which adds up to around $200 trillion. Actually, the $18 trillion is, believe it or not, is the good news, which is pretty frightening.
In 1960, the unwed birth rate was 15%, and now it's almost 50%.
And it's over 90% in many, many American cities.
Nearly a 1,000% increase in health care and tuition costs since 1980. Percent on welfare in the 1980s, what was it, about 15, 16, 17%? And now almost 50% of American homes receive some form of federal benefit, is what they refer to it as. Illegal immigration in the many millions just since 1986, depending on who's telling the story. It's well over 10 million. You take a fellow like me, I believe it's in excess of 40 million, but the numbers don't seem to matter anymore. And the reason I'm making that part of maybe the Enigma report today is what just blows my mind is that when you look at this list, in my mind, these things cannot happen on their own without someone causing them. To have such a massive cultural shift on every topic that you want to talk about within domestic America, and nobody, very few people, I should say, seem to be alerted or concerned.
Well, I think a lot of people are concerned. Clearly, you wouldn't have the popularity of Donald Trump, who is essentially at this point a one-trick pony on immigration. His popularity wouldn't happen if there wasn't a grassroots support of having a real immigration policy.
He's plus or minus 24% of the Republican primary. That's not, when you look at national elections, that's not to say that issue is on fire. And nobody's talking about what $18 trillion
well, he's the
really
leader
is.
of the Republican Party at this point. So it's
He's
likely he'll be the nominee.
He's out in front 1 out of 17.
You bet. And well, the only point is that the enigma is the mystery that our politicians don't get is that people do care about, be it the national debt, be it unwed mothers, be it immigration policy. The enigma is the mystery as to why, if these issues are very important to Americans, why our politicians seem to do nothing about it. And the answer, quite simply, is because there is a political agenda for people who do benefit from it. We just heard from your first guest that over $1 billion a year goes to people who then turn around and give money back to the federal government to bring people into this country that, frankly, maybe we shouldn't be doing.
And in fact, the reason I'm doing the Enigma the way I'm doing it was because of both of the two guests. If you look at the general message that we learned is that communism is being injected and has been being injected into our culture for many decades. And I'm not talking about a little liberal, folks. I'm talking about Marxism.
Bernie Sanders is running as a socialist.
Marxism. And by the way, if you look at the gatherings, to your point about Trump, Bernie Sanders is by far gathering greater crowds than is Trump. And so I don't have a clue who's going to win. But if you're just looking at grassroots, who's on fire about what topic, man, the Marxists are on fire. And then if you look at the other topic of our two guests, we have a massive injection of people that have no interest in assimilating to becoming Americans being injected by the United Nations. And you stand back and go, what? Why aren't people on fire over these topics? That to me is an enigma, Jim.
Well, in part, you and I are fairly well read. We're very interested in politics. We both heard things today that I was not aware of. I think one of the reasons that people aren't on fire, that aren't raising a stink, is that they're unaware of the issue or the extent of it.
But they are aware that we had a 15% unwed mother birth rate in 1960s, and now we've got almost 50. They are aware that the inclusion of financial benefits to support Americans, to subsidize American living, is overwhelmingly increased.
Those who are receiving the benefits support it. And if it is 50%, then what you have is a numerical majority, or soon-to-be majority, that will support more federal funding and more free money, at least in their minds.
All of these topics that I listed, and by the way, I always use line graphs. I go search for line graphs. 90% of my money or of my numbers came from the United States government. That's where my source was. And when you look at them on a line graph, America changed dramatically between 1960 and 65. All of the lines that I found, it didn't matter whether we were talking about budgetary...
Great society.
The budgetary injection of these folks the UN are sending, every topic that I could find, it just curved up, and it continues to go up. Folks, we're not at a plateau, and it's not Obama. All these negatives they're going up like rockets, and it's not Obama. It's been happening from when Obama and I were born. It's heading up, and nobody seems to be saying, stop the ponies, what are we doing?
Maybe this idea of Texas wanting to secede is not such a bad idea.
California kind of did by
Northern
default.
California is talking about it. Again, I think there is people have stepped back because they have gone out, they have voted, they have made their voices heard on any number of issues that we want change, and yet we get the same old from both parties consistently.
But then you pause and say, wait a minute. Some of that, and by the way, I'm not painting with a big broad brush, but most of our representatives probably don't have a clue any more than you or I did about the things that our guest was talking about with this other agency that almost as powerful as the UN.
Wasn't that something?
Fascinating.
That in
topics.
fact, Bill Huizenga and Senator Levin and the rest of them don't seem to be interested.
Just a fascinating thing. So I don't know. Listen, folks, our sponsor is Renegade River. Just so those that know, Renegade River was in downtown Spring Lake. It is now located at the intersections of M104 and 120th Street, which is right beside I-96 in Nunica. So come see the new digs, as it were. I'm excited about the changes. New website, renegaderiver.com. I think that Brian has mentioned that once or twice in passing over the last couple of weeks. Beyond that, folks, Jim, thanks for sitting in with us.
Great
Brian,
to be
thank you. Folks, we'll be here next Wednesday at 9 a.m. Have a great week.